4 of them for lift. None of these designs turned out to be practical. The answer lay in a completely new idea. Britain's Harrier, or jump jet as it is popularly known, is the result of many years of research. Today it remains the Western world's only vertical takeoff fighter. The key to its success is vectored thrust, which enables the pilot to vary the direction of his jet from horizontal to vertical. It has been in service with the Royal Air Force since 1969 as a ground attack fighter, capable of operating close to the Army and easily concealed in almost any terrain.
The Harrier started as a result of the climate in the late 50s towards VTOL. It was just another attempt at creating a military jet that could leave the ground vertically because of the anticipated vulnerability of runways. It's basically a very simple aircraft with one engine used for vertical flight, and the same motor is used in horizontal flight. And you couldn't get simpler than that. All the configurations that use separate engines for liftoff have all died. They've all been ruined by history. Weight was dominant all the time. We sweated blood to keep the weight out of the aeroplane. But that aside, the special engineering problem were really in the VSOL systems, the system that rotates the nozzles and the system that the pilot uses to control the aeroplane when he's in the hover.
1 month before I was due to fly this very important aeroplane in my life, it looked as if I was going to miss it, because in Germany, when I was demonstrating a Hunter, I was being driven home by a not very capable driver. He hit some trees. I smashed my ankle, and there I was in hospital thinking I was going to lose this chance of a lifetime. Anyway, plastered ankle, the following morning I managed to persuade the surgeon to allow me to go back to England in my Hunter. I hopped everywhere. I wouldn't use crutches. I drove my motor car. I flew dual in every airplane and helicopter I could lay my hands on, and eventually the Central Medical Board gave me a category unique in aviation history of fit civil test pilot, tethered hovering only. And that is exactly how I started that program.
The first tethered flight was in October 1960.
And I remember opening the throttle and the airplane bumping around a little bit, and suddenly there was a feeling of being off the ground. Subsequently, I think it was proved that we lifted off and the tethers actually were stabilizing the airplane. And then we put it back on the ground, and that was the very first tethered hover that we did.
The tethers were removed the following month, and Bill Bedford worked towards making the first transition to forward flight in March 1961.
We lifted off on this day, and I suppose that really was one of the most exciting moments, to feel the concept being fulfilled as the aircraft accelerated so smoothly, just like a brick sliding along virgin ice through to a wing-borne flight. And we realized we'd done it. We realized then that we had made the important step forward and proved the basic concept, although there was a very large amount of development work that had to be done to refine it for operational use.
By 1963, the vectored thrust system had been thoroughly tested. Hawker, the manufacturer, was eager to show off its new aircraft at the Paris Air Show, where it would be seen against its French rival, the Balzac. Bill Bedford began his display with a superb demonstration of his machine's versatility.
I completed my decelerating transition, was in the middle of a pirouette, when suddenly the bottom fell out of my lift, and I felt myself plummeting earthwards, and ignominiously I crashed in front of the president's tent on the concrete platform, with a progressive disintegration of the undercarriage and very expensive noises taking place.
The crash was only a minor setback. Bedford had already shown that the Harrier concept had a wide range of applications, including the ability to operate from ships.
True to say that some of our friends in the Navy at the time who were fighting to retain the large aircraft carrier were not wildly enthusiastic in 1963 when we did the first trial on board HMS Ark Royal. And I remember Flag Officer Aircraft Carriers Admiral Donald Gibson kindly said, "Bill, the thing that impressed me most was the complete absence of fright on the part of the spectators. New airplanes normally come aboard bigger, heavier and faster, and here was a complete reversal of the trend. As far as I'm concerned, it's far better to stop and land than land and try and stop."
The Harrier was eventually developed as a naval fighter as well. Using a ramp on the flight deck, it could take off with a heavier payload than in vertical flight. By then, the Americans had expressed an interest.
We had been invited by the British Aerospace people to come to the Farnborough Air Show and observe it. We made the request that we fly it. That set them back a little bit, thinking that because they had so few of them at the time, but it was very important for us to take a look at the airplane to check possibilities. We expected to get 3 or 4 flights each, maybe, and at the last day of the Farnborough show, Bill Bedford came up to me and he said, "Well, we're very sorry, but we're only received permission to allow you 10 flights each." Well, we kind of swallowed and smiled and said, "Well, we figure we can get along with that, so thank you very much." We were totally sold on the fact that it was the answer to what we've been looking for in the high-performance aircraft, provide close air support for the Marine on the ground. It far exceeded anything else that was on the drawing boards that we knew of. The Marines were totally convinced that the Harrier was for them and remain so today.
The Harrier was adapted for the United States Marine Corps as the AV-8. It is one of the mainstays of the Marines' close support squadrons, and it is now a much larger and more potent fighter than the early Harriers. The Harrier remains the only aircraft of its kind.
And I think it's still the world's most misunderstood fighter. You have to recollect and remember that 98 or 9% of the world's Air Force fly CTOL, conventional takeoff and landing, and there is an enormous investment in airfields of airplanes that do that. And you can't change the direction of a military service very quickly. So when the Harrier comes along and it opens up the possibility of moving your tactical airplanes away from bases, because those bases are vulnerable in war, naturally the chief of an Air Force thinks, well, okay, maybe I do need Harriers, but what about all these other jets I'm buying and operating? What are my masters, my president, and my politicians going to think if I effectively send the message? They may not be there when we need them because the runways could be denied. And that's the Harrier's worst enemy, I think.
But helicopters and Harriers are no longer the only types of aircraft which can fly vertically.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, the aircraft that will take flight to a new dimension, the V-22 Osprey.
The Osprey achieves the transition from vertical to horizontal flight by tilting its rotors. Like the Harrier, it is the only example of its kind. The idea for a tilt-rotor aircraft is not new. The first designs were made before the war. They were called convertiplanes. It is only with more recent technical advances in aerodynamics and materials that such aircraft have become a reality. The first tilt-rotors flew in 1955 in America. That early work culminated in 1977 with the first flight of the technology demonstrator, the XV-15. Developing a completely new type of aircraft is a very long-term undertaking. The XV-15 was only made possible by the sustained research work over 30 years by many individuals working in several companies under the auspices of NASA and the Department of Defense.
The idea behind tilt-rotor was that you could combine the best assets of a helicopter and a fixed-wing airplane and do the job of two different types of aircraft in one. The advantages of tilt-rotor over a helicopter and conventional fixed-wing is that a helicopter will be cruising normally 140, 150 knot range. We're cruising at 275 to 280 knots. So the speed of a tilt-rotor is roughly twice that of a conventional helicopter. At the same time, the power required is much less, so you're burning a lot less fuel than a helicopter would.
A tilt-rotor is more efficient because, unlike a helicopter, the fixed wing provides lift, leaving all the power of the rotors to be converted into forward speed.
The XV-15 was in New York in the summer of '84, and we made a flight from Battery Park, which is lower Manhattan, direct flight to Bolling Air Force Base, Washington, D.C., which is about a 200-mile flight. And we made it in about 45 minutes, point to point. That same flight, if you originated in downtown Manhattan, it would have been at least a 45-minute cab ride to the major airport in order to catch a shuttle flight. So your round trip to Washington might have been on the order of 2.5 hours.
The XV-15 has proved the technology of tilt-rotor. It has also shown the enormous practical value of aircraft which can fly directly between 2 points at high speed. That ability signals one path towards a solution to the ever-increasing congestion on runways, in the airways, and at airport terminals today.
I think the tilt-rotor has advantages that will capture a large percentage of the helicopter market as we know today, and it will also take some of the roles of fixed-wing market. It will create a niche in its own right between the two aircraft. It won't replace totally either one, but it will create a whole new industry.
The tilt-rotor embodies both the dreams and the technical breakthroughs of the early pioneers of vertical flight. Their ultimate vision is on the threshold of fulfillment. With the Osprey, tilt-rotor is moving from the experimental phase to the military phase, and there is little doubt that in the decades ahead, airline passengers will find the tilt-rotors commonplace. mastery of the skies. The fighter. Extracting the last ounce of performance from airframe and engine. The same demands are made of the men who fly them. That's why fighter pilots are an elite among aviators.
Fighter pilot is an attitude. It is cockiness, it is aggressiveness, it is self-confidence, it is a streak of rebelliousness, and it is competitiveness. There's something else. There's a spark, there's a desire to be good, to do well in the eyes of your peers and in your own eyes. I think it is love of that blue vault of sky that becomes your playground. If, and only if, you're a fighter pilot. You don't understand it if you're flying from A to B in straight and level and merely climb and descend. You're moving through the basement of that vault of blue. A fighter pilot is a man in love with flying. A fighter pilot sees not a cloud, but beauty. Not the ground, but something remote from him. Something that he doesn't belong to as long as he's airborne. He's a man who wants to be second best to no one.
Many regard the United States F-16 as the best fighter in the world today. It's fast, highly maneuverable, and deadly. The essential qualities of every successful fighter plane. In World War II, there were a few fighters more successful than the P-51, the Mustang. Introduced in 1943, it was the long-range fighter with the job of escorting Allied bombers over Germany. Unlike earlier fighters, such as the Spitfire or Lightning, it had the range to fly deep into the Reich. Once there, it had the performance to beat or match every German aircraft sent up against it. More than any other fighter, the Mustang destroyed the Luftwaffe.
All of a sudden, this new airplane appeared on the scene, the P-51. We knew nothing of its maneuverability, how far it would go. We discovered it was quite a remarkable machine. It was the same engine as the Spitfire. You knew you had more power than you'd ever had before. You could feel the acceleration on takeoff. Of course, you were kind of pushing back in your seats like when you take off in a jet. This is the exhilarating feeling. You feel like that now you've got something you can do great things with.
beautiful little airplane. Fell in love with that immediately. Its ability is legend. Its range, adequate firepower, comfort, durability, reliability, everything about it was something that a fighter pilot dreamed of, and there it was. So to this day, my heart really is in that P-51 cockpit.
We felt more secure in the Mustang than any other airplane. We felt we really had something that we could fight the German on an equal basis. And this is very important, to have the confidence. You could go and go and go. You could stay up 8 hours. The bombers would take off 6 o'clock in the morning. We'd take off at 8, and we'd meet them at noon, somewhere, some point over Germany. All that time, the Germans could be having breakfast, playing tennis, and doing most anything they wanted to do until we got to the point where they were supposed to intercept us. The bomber boys used to brag about, oh, we can go in by ourselves. They were bomber boys. They wanted to prove that they could do it. Well, of course, they couldn't. They took terrible losses.
When we started escorting the bombers in P-51s, we flew very close to the bombers. I think that was for their morale purposes, and nobody had really thought out the situation to a logical conclusion. It just seemed the thing to do, to fly alongside, maybe a mile away, and fight the oncoming Luftwaffe. Well, that was a dumb thing to do when you get right down to it, because you can't defend against a determined attack by the enemy. But then, stupid people start wars, and stupid people run wars, and very seldom listen to the people who are fighting the wars. It was a raid to Berlin, beautiful, beautiful day. The B-17 box that we were escorting was at 32,000 feet. How those men stood at those open windows, I'll never know, but there they were. Suddenly, that box of bombers was hit by waves of Focke-Wulf 190. It was carnage. They knocked down 52 of them in about 3 minutes. And we were sandwiched, 1 or 2 of us, in between these attacking waves. And of course, we didn't stop them. You can't stop a determined attack, well planned and executed. The best way to defend the bombers is to